Since I haven't made a video about it, I decided it would be a good time to discuss at least a certain segment of the Occupy Wall Street now. Now, Occupy Wall Street, as far as I can tell, is similar to the Tea Party in that it's a pretty broad range, rather amorphous entity, if you even want to call it that, slash movement, and uh, there'd be no point in trying to rigorously critique every part of it or point out the parts that I might agree with. What I like to instead focus on is an area where what's going on in Occupy Wall Street has more general significance, and that is the irony of one of the more uniform demands that you see them making, and that is for calls for greater government regulations, greater government spending, greater government in general, uh, with the idea that this is somehow going to curb the excesses of Wall Street. And this is ironic because it is the government regulation, and government spending, and government power generally that engorges Wall Street and always has. And I think it's prescient because Occupy Wall Street is certainly not a new kind of leftist uh, movement in this sense. Leftists have always kind of felt this way, and it's ironic, and it's sad, and it's stupid. Um, there's a mythology about the role of government in how they regulate business that really is a mythology. There is no coherent theory that really would back it up, because anybody who thinks about it even for a moment would realize, well, government regulators have no real incentive to regulate. Uh, they have every incentive to be corrupted, to be bribed. Also, even if they're not corrupt, the very nature of the fact that they are going to depend on the industries that they regulate. For instance, in the oil industry, the regulators of the oil industry will never favor the abolition of the oil industry, because then they'd have no industry to, they'd have to get different jobs. And even though they're bureaucrats, that they probably would just assume stay in the same office doing the same things. Beyond that, because what they do is based on taxes, there's no market mechanism for them to really judge if they're doing a good job regulating. Further, more than that, there's moral hazard. People assume, well, since the government has certified something as safe or uh, secure, then it is, when this is not the case. Government regulations typically are very, very substandard, even when they're enforced, and they very, very rarely are. I mean, in the many years I worked in food service, on occasion I did encounter government regulators, perhaps less than once per year, and the standards that they insisted upon were orders of magnitude below those of my employers, and my employers weren't doing it because they're nice and they love people and they really care whether you get sick or not. It's because they care about their business and their bottom line, and they realize that if they were to have unclean or unsafe food, if they were ever to make anyone sick, or even have people think that they were made sick, even if they're not, that in itself is scary enough to a company that makes food. That the safety standards were far, far more rigorous. So theoretically, it doesn't make sense. Historically, regulatory agencies never act uh, in the benefit of consumers. Now, the facts that liberals, leftists, and statists attribute as to proving their case are laughable. Now, by far, the most famous source on this is The Jungle by Upton St. Clair. Now, there's a number of problems with The Jungle. I think the most obvious one that isn't pointed out enough is that The Jungle is not some kind of empirical study or rigorous intellectual work. It is a novel. It is a novel. It is a work of fiction. Now, you might say that perhaps he drew some inspiration from reality, but it is a work of fiction. And I dare say how laughable liberals would find it if, say, I were to quote Atlas Shrugged as an authoritative study to prove my point. They would obviously and rightly point out Atlas Shrugged is just a novel. although a far more popular and important novel than Upton St. Clair's book. It is a novel. It is not a study of economics. It's not a study of history. It's a novel, and Upton St. Clair's book is a novel. Upton St. Clair's book is also a work of propaganda, which he admitted. He never at any point said that it was an objective study. It was a work of propaganda that actually had a different goal than the one he had in mind. Uh, he actually wanted to just bring about a socialist state, not a regulatory state. He said he was aiming for our hearts, he hit our bellies. Talk about, this is, the cliche with socialists and government planning is that it always has unintended consequences. Second, beyond this book, people will point to the passage of certain regulatory acts as evidence of government progressively making our lives better. This is, of course, silly. Historically, and let's just stick for now to the example of meat packing / food processing. Uh, Regulations never come about because there's a mass movement of consumers, regular folks, who desire that this or that industry be regulated. For instance, the AMA did not come into existence because hundreds or thousands of maimed patients who were harmed by unlicensed doctors marched on Washington demanding the government license doctors. No, the AMA, the American Medical Association, which was a private organization of doctors, lobbied the government to do that. Likewise, there was no mass movement of people demanding that the government regulate the evil meat packers. It was the evil meat packers themselves who had lobbied the government for a long time. Now, actually, the history goes quite a bit before Upton St. Clair. I think it should be obvious that consumers of food products prefer, all things being equal, that the food products that they have some assurance that they are safe, or at least consumable to some level. Now, you can never have complete certainty, and not every single consumer is going to rigorously look into the details, but this is hardly necessary for there to be regulation, market regulation. For instance, most people don't buy their food directly from the producers, they buy them from a retailer, and the retailers have a very strong interest in the things being on their shelves being safe and consumable and meeting standards of their consumers. In fact, they would prefer to advertise how safe and good their food is. And often when meat packers would come to wholesalers to say, we would like to sell your meat, they would ask, well, how do we know that it's safe? And if the response was not very convincing, aka because we say it's safe, or because there's a certification board that we created that obeys our very whim says it's safe, this is not very convincing. And so what happened is the meat packers said, well, I guess we're going to have to front the money somehow to make a legitimate attempt to verify that our product is safe. And they started to do this. But at the same time, they began to think, well, wouldn't it be better if we could externalize this cost and perhaps have the taxpayer do it for us? And so they lobbied for the government to perform this service on their behalf. And it didn't get very far until the Europeans started banning the importation of American meats, usually animal by animal, say cows or pigs, it depended on the country. And usually the reasons for that wasn't because there was some sweeping epidemic of bad meat from America. It was because local producers, say in Germany, would say, we don't like to compete with this cheap American beef. They go to the German government and have them slap a big tariff and say, unless you can prove that your meat's safe, it's not going to be admitted into Germany. The meat packers in America went to the United States and said, we need you to say our meat's safe so we can sell it in Germany. And so that's how it really started. And we could go down the list of all the industries. And so at one point, the main reason is just to externalize a cost. They know that their food has to be somehow shown to be edible and safe. And although there were attempts and a movement towards making it safe through paying their own money, it didn't take long for them to realize we should just have the taxpayer pay to do this. But then there was an ancillary effect of this that they began to pursue above and beyond that, and that was the idea that we can use regulations to put our competitors out of business. This is in economics, this is called regulatory capture, or more generally, rent seeking, to have the government provide you with basically a direct or indirect subsidy. And this is where I think the Wall Street people are hilariously ironic, because it is clear historically that regulations are used to favor usually the larger producers, not necessarily always, but usually at the expense of the smaller ones. I remember 2 or 3 years ago, a law was passed that basically would outlaw all toys that didn't meet very, very stringent requirements to see whether they had lead in them. Now, there was no Million Mom March for safe toys. There was Mattel and Hasbro, who can afford this type of regulation, putting out of business everybody who cannot, which is basically almost everybody. This also would eliminate the legal secondary market. Legally, you cannot buy or sell toys at a yard sale if they have not been tested for lead and any number of other potentially harmful things. Now, in practice, I don't know that this has really been enforced, but for the small producers, it will be if it hasn't already, and it will put them out of business. Mattel and Hasbro favor this. And so this whole concept that regulation is against business and that government is this antagonistic, as Chomsky would say, a cage protecting us from a tiger is ridiculous. This is something that is greatly engorging the tiger to our detriment and at a cost to us, because we have to pay for all that. Now, there's a couple other, they're not quite so ironic, but just silly ideas when it comes to regulation. One is the unbelievably absurd claim that we have been in some kind of period of deregulation during the Bush years. Now, this is asserted ad infinitum. I don't know how many times I've heard it, but the basis for it is, absurd. Other than the occasional free market rhetoric from a few Republicans, which has no detectable effect on policy, pretty much the only thing I've ever heard is, well, they repealed, although there wasn't a repeal so much as amendment of Sarbanes-Oxley. There is, of course, a lot of problems with assuming that the repeal of Sarbanes-Oxley caused the economic collapse, but even assuming that that was an example of a regulation being repealed, at that same time, many, many thousands of pages of additional new regulations were added to the Federal Register, which grows. It consistently grows on the magnitude of tens of thousands of pages per year under Bush. So I don't know how you can say, well, we've added tens of thousands of new regulations. 1 or 2 were repealed, hence we are in a deregulatory environment. This is completely disingenuous, or I think rather more likely extremely ignorant. There's massive increases in regulation, and there always has been throughout Republican and Democratic administrations. In fact, the only administration I'm aware of, the closest one that could be said to have deregulated the most, would probably be the Carter administration, and even that on net added many more regulations than they deregulated. Carter's administration did actually deregulate a number of fairly important industries, something that very few people are aware of, but of course he was a Democrat. I still say on net he increased regulations enormously. But this idea, the federal government and to say nothing of the state and local governments, have increased regulations nonstop in a tidal wave ever since, they've existed pretty much. There's never been a period of deregulation other than, say, the end of World War I or the end of World War II, where many of the war provisions were eliminated. Unfortunately, not all of them. Those are the only instances where really it's happened. So there's that. The other thing is they say that because he cut taxes, now government, or the government has somehow become more marginal because of tax cuts. The tax cuts were pathetically minute, and two, the government has increased spending, so it really doesn't matter. This idea that uh, as long as taxes are not going up, that the government is shrinking is absurd. If the government is spending more, then the government is distorting the economy. If the government spends trillions of dollars, say let's say Obama says that we need more shovel-ready jobs, and so he literally decides to spend $1 trillion on shovels. That doesn't just mean that we will suddenly have more shovels. We will have more shovels. That's true. But it also means that all the resources that are used to make shovels, namely steel, wood, the labor involved, the energy requirements to use the metallurgy to produce them, will be bid away from other uses. And I don't have a figure on me, but I'm going to say that many industries use iron and wood and electricity and power and labor, and those, instead of being a large number of those available resources, will be channeled into making shovels rather than some other useful thing that people actually want, as opposed to a whim of the Obama administration or the Bush administration for that matter. So yes, Reagan maybe didn't raise taxes, but by spending so much money, in his case on the military, although also on domestic spending, he is still altering the economy. He's causing distortions. We have too much. We have a brain drain, for one thing. All these really smart people go to build missiles and nerve gas, and God knows what other horrible death machines, rather than build other things. But then all the material, all the steel and copper and gold and silver and energy go into these rather than others. So we all pay higher energy bills. We pay more for steel and resources, and we may pay more for the goods that are made out of them. But since taxes didn't really go up, then the allegation is that the government somehow shrank. And this is just silly. The government has grown, and the only question is by what kind of logarithm or algorithm or algebra we need to do to trace that growth. Is it exponential, or is it linear, or is it logarithmic? We don't. That's the question, not whether it's shrunk or not. It hasn't shrunk. It's grown immensely. And I also think it's interesting. By any conceivable measure, the government is much bigger now than it was 30 years ago. And the Occupy Wall Street people are always harping on, well, in the last 30 years or 40 years, it doesn't make too much of a difference how far back you want to put the line. To say, well, back then, the top 1% only had this percentage, and now it has much more. Well, that's true. I haven't analyzed those numbers, but I'm going to accept that they're correct. But don't they see that the government has increased enormously in that same period? So the idea that if only we had had a greater increase in the size and scope and power of government, that perhaps we'd have the egalitarianism that for some reason they think is normative. I'm not, that fact alone that the government has grown and disparity has grown doesn't prove that it was the government that caused it, although I think it almost certainly has. But it certainly should put some doubt in the idea that it's small governmentism that causes, because we haven't had small governmentism. Government has been getting bigger and bigger in terms of its power, in terms of its regulatory authority, in terms of its spending, and actually in terms of how much it brings in. So the Occupy Wall Street people, by calling for more government, the other thing is government spending. The millionaires and billionaires on Wall Street, mostly the billionaires, have far more influence in directing the flow of that money and its recipients than do some hippie in a tent who beats on a drum about people power and has zombie mass votes. They have no say whatsoever. So these torrents of government money will be used to the benefit primarily of Wall Street and of the most despicable parts of Wall Street. As a libertarian, as a free market person, I don't feel the need to carry much water for Wall Street. It is a very, very, very mixed bag. Obviously, I like the idea of commerce, of mutual trade, mutually beneficial arrangements. But much of Wall Street, and I'm not going to say how much because I don't know, is a glutton for the lifeblood of the country that they take out of the public trough. Uh, we are taxed, and that tax money or that inflation money, which in the end is going to have the same negative effect, is directed towards them, and they consume it. And it's not voluntary trade; it's plunder, as Bastiat would say, and they benefit from it. And by calling for the government to expend yet more, then they are just encouraging a greater engorging of the worst elements of Wall Street, the very worst elements of Wall Street. And it is very ironic, it's very sad, and I wish that they would grow up and maybe read a book or think about these things before they just go with their heart, which I think is almost always the case. The disproportionate sway of emotion in so many socialists is so evident and so foolish that uh, I do think that there must be some kind of personality reason why they would uh, feel so strongly about something that they know so little about. Uh, I mean, there's no evidence that increased voting or democracy will alleviate any of our problems. There's no evidence that increased government spending will help or that it won't make the banksters even richer. Uh, and even ignoring the bloodthirstiness of the government when it comes to war, there's no evidence that its regulatory state is operated to the benefit of anybody other than the industries that it's supposed to regulate. Every once in a while, they'll have to have a sacrificial lamb, and they will maybe come down harder on this or that firm, but this is very unusual, and they almost never punish the regulators. It's almost as if they it couldn't possibly be malfeasance on their part that something bad happened. Who got fired for BP? Who got fired for 9/11? Nobody. Who gets fired when the FDA bans life-saving drugs or holds them up for 10 years off the market and literally tens of thousands of people die? Who gets in trouble for that? Nobody. Nobody. They get promotions for that. I mean, the FDA is one of the most atrocious. I didn't specifically address it here, but uh, nobody gets in trouble for that. They're incentivized to basically, and they like it when we die, when citizens suffer, then they can say, oh look, we need more power, then we'll be able to handle this. And I don't know, the Occupy Wall Street people, they eat that all. And fortunately, I don't think they're a majority of the country, but even if those specific types of people aren't the majority, the idea of a regulatory state and its efficacy is pretty widespread, not just within leftist circles. And this is sad. So I'm going to try and put some links in the bottom. The Mackinac Center, which is spelled Mackinac, but is French spelling of an Indian word. People in Michigan know how to say it. No one else does. The Mackinac Center has a good paper on Upton St. Clair in the jungle. And there's another paper by someone, I don't remember who, I'll try and find it, about Sarbanes-Oxley. I saw someone post these on Facebook not long ago, and someone commented that he just didn't have time to read them, but they must be a lie. Yes, that's good argumentation. It's about the level I expect, though.